Welcome back to Move with Joe. Today we are going to be talking about golfing. So I just got done working with a client. He's an amateur golfer, gets out several times a week, and he's trying to, one, improve his golf game, but he's also developed some low back pain. And so there are a couple little things that we tweaked during his session in terms of his alignment, how he organizes through his spine and skeleton to get him performing better. So when my client went to go align himself to swing, the first thing that he would do would he would begin to round his shoulders and begin to look down at the ball. And when this occurs, the extensor muscles in the back have to begin to engage, holding him upright, because now his center of mass is forward of his feet, and so now something in his musculature has to start engaging to hold himself upright. So he's not balanced over top of himself. And so first thing he would do is start to round his shoulders and his head coming down. Then he'd bend his knees. And you can tell I'm kind of tucked under here. So now my back muscles are already fully engaged and they're less available for actually any type of movement. So what we began to work on is having him, instead of coming into this collapsed position where he's falling forward, starting to be able to find the hinge point in his hips. So by starting to drive the hips back a little bit and use that as a counterbalance, so you can think of the hips as a counterbalance to the head. So as the head comes forward, the hips come back. And as the hips come forward, the head comes back. So all we're doing is starting to create a pivot point, a hinge point from which to move. And so this is going to start to create more power in his swing and allow him to have more force coming through the pelvis versus that force coming from the back, which ultimately is going to mean less back pain for him and better performance golfing. So the other thing that he would do is, as he drove his hips back, he would actually begin to tilt his pelvis forward, and that would create compression in the low back. So he had this extra hinge here. And so again, that's creating more shearing force in the back, which we don't want. So the more we can keep our spine neutral as we hinge forward from our hips, from the hip joint, and not have any compensations of the tail tucking too much under or forward, that way we'll get more power and more pure movement through the hips. So one more time. As he wants to line up with the ball, instead of rounding from the chest, begin by hinging, driving the hips back, and then the head comes forward. And now he's balanced over top of his feet, and he can start driving the ball from there. So hopefully this is helpful. These types of things, even though we're talking about golfing, they apply to everything else that we do. So even when we were chatting about him sitting, he had a very similar pattern in his sitting. So what we did was we talked about how he could, every time he sits, begin to play around with finding this hinge, which is the same thing that he's doing in his golf game. So you can see there's widespread use for this stuff. And when we start finding these little subtle habitual patterns that we have, and we start creating better, more efficient movement, it can be applied to everything that we do. And same thing with weightlifting. So he also does a fair amount of lifting. And so we were talking about a deadlift, which he hasn't been practicing in a while. But if you were to take his same technique of coming down by bending his knees, there's no way, if I have a weighted bar, that I could bring the bar down, because I'd run into my knees, or thighs in this case. So again, first thing, hinging the hips back, and then when you get the bar below the knees, then the knees can come forward a little bit. And as you come up, reverse that movement. So you can see there's applications through all of the daily movements that we do, from having to come down to pick something up, playing our sports activities, even something as simple as sitting. So even if you aren't a golfer, I hope you found today's tips and tricks useful. It's really about how we better optimize our skeletal alignment and how we stay stable and balanced, and then how we transfer and distribute the forces through the whole of ourself. So the more we tune into these little subtle habits that we have, and we start picking up on where we're finding counterbalance and how we're using leverage in our movement, the more efficient, the more fun you're going to have, the better performance, and the less wear and tear you're going to ultimately have.